Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to provide context in the war in Ukraine. I have four big stories for you. Sorry it took a little while. I was at the eye doctor earlier, and my eyes are just getting back to normal after having my eyes dilated. So I had this thing on when I was doing the last video with Greg Terry. We were just discussing things, so I didn't have to focus on my text here. Okay, so the big story is clearly what happened with the Istanbul negotiations, and so I just want to kind of walk you through what happened so that you understand everything. Expectations of a breakthrough were low as Ukraine and Russia delegations prepared to meet in Istanbul. I think that's an understatement. Nobody thought anything was going to come out of this. Putin's rejection of Zelensky's invitation demonstrates that Putin has continued his resistance to making any concessions and engaging in legitimate, good faith negotiations. I think that's fair as well. Darth Putin, the humorist, put out this: my negotiators were late as they had to wait for my ballistic missiles to land on civilians before peace talks could start, which proves Ukraine wants to continue the war. I mean, it is almost like that. The Russians were a little bit late. That's clearly not why. Although, as I understand, right now in the air, there's 100 some odd drones and missiles are loading up on the kinds of planes that carry the ballistic missiles. So we'll see how this all plays out. Trilateral talks kick off in Istanbul. First up at 10:45, a meeting between Ukraine, the United States, and Turkey. And then at 12:30, between Ukraine, Turkey, and Russia. Okay, not United States would not be in that meeting. So there's a trilateral meeting between Turkey, the U.S., and Ukraine underway. U.S. side included Secretary of State Rubio, Ambassador Tom Barrack. You've not heard of him because he's kind of a lower level guy. And Ukraine envoy Keith Kellogg. Notably, Witkoff was absent. Okay, so I think that's a positive sign, but not much of one. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was there, and then he's like, you know what? I mean, unless my counterpart, Lavrov, is going to be here, I'm not going to be coming to this meeting. Now, he said this before the meeting, this quote I'm about to read, before the actual meeting. The level of the team that was sent by the Russian side is certainly not indicative of one that's going to lead to a major breakthrough. I hope that I'm wrong. Yeah, well, he's not wrong. And here he refused to attend the talks himself as the Kremlin sent lower-level delegation. Secretary of State will instead hold a separate meeting with the Ukrainian delegation, and they did that thing. And then the Russians were demanding to kick the U.S. and Turkey out of the talks. How about that? So they're like kind of flexing their muscles a little bit, like, we want him out of here. So instead, Marco Rubio sent State Department Director of Policy Planning, Michael Anton. And again, if you haven't heard that name, that's because he's kind of a lower level guy. He's on the C team in order to deal with their C team. And so not the A team, not the B team, the C team. Now, the Russian delegation is saying it's against the presence of Americans and even wants Turkish representatives to leave the room after delivering their welcome remarks. How about that? So, I mean, they're asking for the moon and more. Okay, afterwards, Sergei Lavrov says there is a lot of evidence saying neither Berlin nor Paris nor Brussels and especially London really want any peace, says Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Okay, well, they want peace, but they don't want capitulation, which is peace on your terms. And so, yeah, they're going to stand behind Ukraine. Zelensky in full panic mode says Sputnik. Okay, so now let's look at Russian media and see what they have to say. Sputnik says Zelensky's in full panic mode ahead of the Istanbul talks. Putin sends a serious, no-nonsense team ready to get things done. Meanwhile, Zelensky is busy stirring chaos and running to his Western war sponsors for backup. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that Sputnik's putting out. And then you saw other things along these lines, and I'll show you this in just a moment. But here is the negotiating team led by this man here who's speaking. Head of the Russian delegation, Vladimir Medinsky, says, quote, "We have agreed that each side will present its vision of a possible future ceasefire. Each side will spell it out." Well, ceasefire means just stop shooting. So I don't know why you need to spell it out, except that they don't actually want to come to a ceasefire. So they're going to drag their feet and try to gain some ground in the meantime as much as they can so that they can keep putting themselves in a better and better position. Meanwhile, this is in the Kyiv Insider, Russians unleash massive disinformation operations using fake versions of popular Western news sites to push artificial stories about Ukraine-Russia-Istanbul talks. Look, if the truth is on your side, you don't need to make crap up. Like that's just how that works. Okay, so here, and I know it gets cut off a little bit, I apologize. At the center of the operation is a series of fake news articles designed to mimic the appearance of well-known Western publications. These articles falsely portray Zelensky as desperate for negotiations and humiliated by Russian President Vladimir Putin's refusal to attend the upcoming talks personally. That's not humiliating. That makes Putin look bad, not makes Zelensky look bad. Headlines include lines like Zelensky is ready to beg Putin to stop Russian forces and Putin has nothing to talk about with the liar in Istanbul. Okay, so that's what the Russian media is pushing. Now, what did Trump have to say? Trump on the meeting with Putin. Hey, let's set up a meeting as soon as we can set it up. Okay, so yeah, but I don't know that Trump actually wants to set up a meeting and look bad when Putin kind of stiff arms him and doesn't give him anything that he wants. Trump says the world will be a much safer place in 2 to 3 weeks. I'm not sure that I'm buying it. I would like it to be a much safer place, and I'd like him to kind of make some ground here, but I just don't see it happening. Okay, the Ukrainian delegation reportedly refused to withdraw troops because the demand was withdraw all your troops from the Russian territory, which those 4 oblasts they define as Russian territory because constitutionally they claimed it after a fraudulent election. And from partially occupied parts of that territory. In response, the Russian delegates allegedly stood up and warned, next time it will be 5 regions. Okay, so they threatened that because the Ukrainians refused to remove their forces from what they called Russian territory that they've never actually controlled. Okay, this was reported by a journalist from The Economist. There's more. A well-placed source tells me Russia said it would agree to a ceasefire only if Ukraine withdraws from the 4 annexed provinces Russia doesn't even fully control. Moscow also threatened to seize 2 more, Kharkiv and Sumy. So that's not 5, that's 6. And then it gets even better if we read Margarita Simonyan's post. She says story has been making rounds that Ukrainians were outraged when Russian negotiators said that Ukrainian soldiers must leave the 4 new Russian regions as part of a ceasefire, to which the Moscow delegation replied, next time it will be 5. Now, our reporter in Istanbul got to ask the Russian side how it really went down. We didn't say 5, we said 8. So they're doubling it. Okay, so I mean, this is how Russian propaganda news kind of works. Like they just go to these crazy extremes that are unbelievable. But okay, let's say they said 8. Why would anybody else report something different? Okay, what are the responses? Well, Zelensky says the U.S. has exerted more pressure on Ukraine than on Russia amid a peace push. Okay, and that's right. That's why we very much want to see a clear pressure applied to Russia through sanctions from Europe and the U.S. Okay, I mean, you'd think, but the way to get Russia to the table, like Zelensky's at the table. He wants to get to the table. Russia, not so much. So where do you apply the pressure? Let's do it more on Ukraine. That makes sense. Okay. Now, allies are looking at it. This is Keir Starmer of Britain saying what we saw yesterday and last night is further proof that Putin is not serious about peace. He has fled. I think that's fair. Italian Prime Minister Meloni says in the past few hours, it's become clear who's truly ready to take steps toward peace and who clearly isn't. Yeah, I mean, it's clear. German Chancellor Merz says the fact that President Zelensky went to Istanbul is a huge gesture. Putin did not show up and thereby put himself at a disadvantage. New sanctions package is ready. We will adopt it on Tuesday in Brussels. Well, I hope they actually do something because they've been talking about, well, we're going to do this package. And then they're like, oh, you're going to have a meeting. Let's wait. Don't wait. Just keep putting those things out. German Chancellor Merz said Russia has broken all the rules that we have established for our coexistence in Europe since the end of the Second World War, and above all, since overcoming the division of Europe. The Russian war of aggression has been raging in Ukraine for more than 3 years now. Russian troops are killing and murdering women and children, civilian soldiers daily. This war has claimed lives of hundreds of thousands of victims, including on the Russian side. Ladies and gentlemen, this war and its outcome will not only decide the fate of Ukraine, the outcome of this war will determine whether law and order will continue to prevail in Europe and the world in the future, or the right of the strongest will prevail. Yeah, that's really what it amounts to. Okay. Again, Mertz is saying he's deciding that the Russian sanctions package on the 20th will come because Putin wasn't there. And so, like, he gave him a chance, and he gave him a chance, and then they gave him a chance, and then they gave him a chance. They're giving way too many chances. Okay, here's former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine, Kurt Volker, saying, quote, "We need to step up the pressure on Russia so that Russia feels like it doesn't have a choice, that they actually have to agree to a ceasefire. We need to tighten up the sanctions on Russia, really try to starve their state finances so it's more and more difficult to pay for their military operations." And then he continues, "We need to continue to supply Ukraine with weaponry and ammunition so that it can better and better defend itself and defeat this Russian aggression. We are far from that right now. Russia wants to continue the war." And he continues that the best possible deterrence is NATO membership, but as far as the U.S. delegation is concerned, it seems like it's off the table. Mike Pompeo, who's the former Secretary of State under Donald Trump, said Putin has no real interest in peace or a ceasefire. I think that's right. Britt Hume from Fox News says Mr. Putin's no-show is the latest evidence that Russia isn't serious about ending the war. And it's no surprise. Mr. Putin thinks Mr. Trump might abandon Ukraine and make it easier for him to keep taking Ukrainian territory. All right, here is Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro is a fairly well-known figure on the right side of the spectrum, and he visited Zelensky about 3 weeks ago, about a month ago, and since then he's been singing a very different tune. Like, he's never been anti-Ukraine, but he's now full-throatedly anti-Russian. And listen to what he has to say.
And so Putin continues to sort of run around and not go to the negotiations while constantly maintaining a vigilant and increased military presence in eastern Ukraine. You know, what is the alternative going to be? I mean, presumably it's going to be President Trump saying that we continue to support the Ukrainians to prevent them from collapsing. And to President Trump's absolute credit, he is recognizing what Putin is doing right now in some ways. So President Trump, in recent weeks, asked advisors if they think that Putin has changed since his last time in office and expressed surprise at some of Putin's military moves, including bombing areas with children. That is according to the Wall Street Journal. Okay, so at least he's waking up to the reality. That is a good thing.
Well, I'd like to think that he's waking up to the reality, but it just doesn't feel like he's waking up quick enough, or that he is awake. Pope Leo XIV has proposed to host peace talks between Ukraine and Russia at the Vatican. How about that? I don't know that anything will come of it, but it's on the table. Now, last little bit, Poland is preparing its 47th military aid package for Ukraine worth 200 million euros, and it'll be transferred in the coming months. And Poland also, the head of the Polish embassy in Ukraine, is confirming that they're going to transfer MiG-29s to Ukraine, and that's possible. Poland is phasing out the MiG-29s and in favor of F-16s. And so, yeah, I mean, they've given a lot of support to Ukraine. They've been very faithful friends. All right. I usually end with Darth Putin, but here I might end with Garry Kasparov. Darth Putin said, "Have rejected my own proposal for peace talks without preconditions, proving Ukraine wants war." Well, Garry Kasparov, sounding just like Darth Putin, said Putin rejects his own peace proposal, then Trump and Europe reject their own deadlines to punish him for it. That's quite an insight. Like, just go forward and turn the screws on the victimizer, not the victim. All right, my friends, last little bit that I have here is this. Before we talk to Ukraine again, we have to define what ceasefire actually means. The Kremlin is unsure about the concepts of cease and fire and who is supposed to do which. All right, my friends, that's all that I have. Thank you for your time, the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.